This morning, we're going to be joined by former Mayor of Toronto, John Sewell. He was Mayor of Toronto from 1978 to 1980, so he knows a thing or two about running the city. It's why his article in Post City recently caught my attention. The title of this article, "The City of Toronto Needs to Ask the Province for a Divorce." And here's how. Hi, John. Are you there?
Hi, good morning. Good morning to you.
Good. Thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So the title really did intrigue me, and I'd love to hear, why do you feel that Toronto and other cities in Canada need protection from the provincial governments?
Well, one of the things provincial governments do, not just in Ontario, but in other cities in Canada, is that they download expenses onto the city that we weren't expecting, or they take away powers that the city had and force new responsibilities onto the city. Mm-hmm. And it's very difficult for a level of government to deal with another level of government that's always changing the rules on it. and what we'd like to do is have some constant rules so we know where we stand.
Right.
We've seen the example in Toronto recently. Let me give you two examples. One is where Premier Ford said, "I'm going to get rid of those bike lanes that Toronto has established." Oh, well, that's pretty interesting. I mean, the province was in the bike lane business. I mean, that's a city kind of a function. Or the second one is that they've moved in on supervised consumption sites,
right,
which try and deal with the opioid crisis, where, more than 500 people a year die in Toronto from overdoses, and the supervised consumption sites save more than that number. They save about 2,000 people a year from overdose death in Toronto, and he's closing them down. So what we'd like to do is try and get an arrangement where there's an agreeable set of rules between the province and the city.
Interesting.
And the problem is that under the Constitution of Canada, the British North America Act from 1867, the courts have interpreted that Constitution to say that cities are the creation of provinces. So provinces are in charge and they can do what they want.
Right.
It's a pretty weird interpretation, but you can understand when they adopted the Constitution, more than 150 years ago. I mean, cities were nothing.
Yeah.
Rural, they were, so don't give cities any power. The world has changed since then. And where it used to be 80% of the people lived in rural areas and 20% in urban areas, it's reversed now.
Right.
So we got to get a change in that. And that's going to require a change in the Constitution of Canada, which sounds difficult, but in fact, it's not that hard. There's a weird little section in the Constitution which says that the province can apply to the federal government for a change in the Constitution if it only applies to that one province. And it needs just a majority vote of the House of Commons and then a majority vote of the Senate. And it's been used maybe a dozen times. Newfoundland used it in order to get rid of separate schools. A fairly contentious issue.
Right.
But it happened. So,
it's
if we
funny.
could get an agreement with the province, then, we just go through that constitutional thing and actually get some certainty.
You make it sound so easy.
That's my life. That's my life. In fact, it is. But the problem is you got to get parties to sit down and agree.
Right. But that's what I mean by you make it sound so easy, and I'm not sure it's quite that simple. So then, for example, as part of that thinking, do you feel that provinces should be giving cities the chance to raise money through taxes like a GST that's, just for the city of Toronto?
Yeah. Well, yes, I do. Cities are very, very short on money. All cities are. And they've been trying to make up for it by raising development charges, which means that, the cost of new housing goes up quite a lot because of those development charges. But there's no other way of cities finding the money to buy, to make community centers and pools and libraries and all that stuff. So for the city to actually get more revenue sources, would really be good. It would also start to get rid of these cost-shared programs that we have. I mean, you look at transit as an example,
right?
Where there's a whole bunch of subsidies poured in by the province, and then the province says, I don't want to put those in anymore. And all of a sudden the city's caught. If we can get out of those cost-shared programs by the city having its own revenues, then we'd be in better shape. And I agree that raising taxes is always contentious, but we got to pay for stuff. And the province doesn't want to pay for affordable housing. Maybe the city needs some taxes so it can start to build a lot of affordable housing.
So recently, the city of New York had a congestion charge. Do you think that Toronto should be doing a congestion fee as well? As you're saying that, we need more revenue places.
Oh, yeah. No question about it. I
really?
think congestion charge, well, it works in other cities really, really, really well. It works well in London. It works well in Paris. It just started in New York, but it seems to be working well. And it's the old thing that if you charge people a price, then they can figure out whether they want to pay it or not.
But don't you think all of these, like the congestion charge, Toronto charging a GST, don't you think that's going to make our city less competitive?
No. I believe that if Toronto had the ability to levy, say it could level 1% extra of an HST, that would raise over $2 billion a year.
Wow.
1%, not very much, but I believe if Toronto got that power, I think we'd find that, Markham wanted the power and Mississauga wanted it, Brampton wanted it, because they have the same problems as Toronto does.
Right.
It's a shortage of funds. So I don't think it would make the city less competitive. But let's face it, Toronto's not very competitive right now. I mean, we're hearing all these articles about how awful Toronto is, and there's a lot of problems in Toronto. Right?
Yeah.
We know that. And I don't, outside of some public money, I don't know how we're going to start solving them. And the point is, we don't seem to be able to attract the provincial or the federal governments to actually step in the right kind of way.
No, it's a good point. I mean, one of the things is that municipalities are not able to run deficits the way that provincial and liberal governments are. Sorry, not liberal, sorry. I shouldn't have said that. Federal governments can. Yeah. So do you think that that's also part of the equation? Do you feel that municipalities should be allowed to run deficits?
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, I like the idea of you spend what you got.
Right.
I mean, you just look at what's happened federally or even provincially, where the provincial government has decided that it can have a deficit by giving all of us $200.
We don't need that money.
Our own money, so I'm not sure that I want the city to have a deficit, but I'd like it to have more revenue to pay its own expenses and not have to rely on those other levels of government.
That makes sense. So if we, let's say in 1 minute, could you give me, what are the top 3 things, if you were mayor today, you would recommend that our city needs to do?
Well, I think the very first thing is we get an agreement with the provincial government to make sure it's not going to download any other costs, that it's not going to take away any of the money that it's now giving us, and that we get more revenue. That's the very first change I'd like to make. The second change I'd like to make is I'd like to start building a lot of affordable housing. Mm-hmm. When I was mayor, we built the St. Lawrence community around the St. Lawrence market, which is wildly successful.
It's very successful. It's a great place, actually. You're right.
It's got a lot of affordable housing in it.
Yeah, it does.
A third of all those units are rent geared to income units. Doesn't feel like it's that kind of a community, but it is. So a lot more affordable housing. And thirdly, I'd like to get that congestion tax so we can start to get a better balance between cars and transit.
Interesting. Great. John, those are interesting suggestions. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's been fascinating.
Maybe I should run again for mayor, eh?
Maybe you should. Why not?
Thank you very much. Really enjoyable.
No problem. Thanks a lot for joining us, John.
Bye-bye.
Bye. That was John Sewell. He's a former mayor of Toronto. He was mayor of Toronto from 1978 to 1980. He's recently written an article in the Post City magazines entitled, "The City of Toronto Needs to Ask the Province for a Divorce." I highly recommend checking out that article.